A city in Arizona constantly floods, not from rain that fell on Arizona, from rain that fell on Mexico. The water collects on the hillsides of Nogales, Sonora, water that shed off rooftops, roads, and factory floors, then flows north by gravity across an international border. It enters Nogales, Arizona, carrying raw sewage, sediment, and debris. The United States spent over $500 million in flood infrastructure to stop it. The country that generated the flooding contributed a fraction of that cost. The agency that managed the solution, the International Boundary and Water Commission, has operated under a 1944 treaty that was never designed for this situation and is audited by no meaningful public body. Most Americans have never heard of Nogales, never heard of the Wash, never heard of the IBWC. This is not a border security story. This is a story about how one country's development decisions became another country's $500 problem. Nogales, Arizona sits in a narrow valley in the Sonoran Desert, pressed hard against the Mexican border. Population roughly 20,000. Median household income well below the national average. It is, by most economic measures, one of the poorest small cities in the United States. The Nogales Wash runs through the center of it. The Wash is a natural drainage arroyo, a channel carved over centuries by stormwater running off surrounding mountain ranges. It enters the U.S. from Sonora, passes under the border fence, cuts through Nogales' downtown commercial district, and drains into the Santa Cruz River. On paper, a geographic feature. In practice, a recurrent disaster zone. When heavy rain falls on Nogales, Sonora, the Wash fills within minutes and overtops its banks. The water arriving in Arizona carried raw sewage because Sonora's combined stormwater and sanitary sewer system discharged directly into the Wash during storm events. EPA water quality monitoring documented fecal coliform levels in the Nogales Wash routinely exceeding safe contact standards, not as occasional anomalies, but as a structural pattern tied to any significant storm on the Sonoran side. The measurements were not preliminary estimates. They reflected years of systematic monitoring, confirming that what crossed the border during flood events was not simply floodwater. It was a public health event in liquid form. Major floods struck in 1977, 1983, and 2008. Businesses flooded. Streets became open channels. Cleanup fell on Arizona residents and Arizona agencies. And every time, the water that caused the damage had not fallen on Arizona. It had fallen miles to the south, on hillsides in another country, on surfaces that shed it rather than absorbed it, and gravity had done the rest. The eventual federal response to this problem, in a city of 20,000 people, would exceed $500 million. That per capita infrastructure investment dwarfs what comparably sized American cities have ever received for flood control. Something made this worth paying for, and something made the federal government wait a very long time before doing it. To understand why the Wash floods the way it does, you have to understand what happened on the other side of the border starting in the 1960s. Nogales, Sonora is not a small town. Its population today is estimated at roughly 250,000, more than 12 times the size of the American side. That asymmetry was not ancient geography. It was built by industrial policy. In 1965, the Mexican government launched the Border Industrialization Program, designed to attract foreign manufacturers to the northern border region through low-cost labor and relaxed regulatory structures. Nogales, Sonora became one of the primary destination cities. Maquiladora factories, assembly plants producing goods for American markets using Mexican labor, arrived in force. Then, NAFTA passed in 1994, and the pace of growth accelerated further. New factories, new worker housing, new commercial streets, parking facilities, and industrial corridors. Hundreds of thousands of people relocated to the hillsides above the Sonoran Valley. Here is what that means hydraulically. Every rooftop sheds water instead of absorbing it. Every paved road increases runoff velocity. Every parking lot and factory floor is an impermeable surface that takes rainfall, which would have soaked slowly into desert soil, and instead sends it racing downhill. The more a city covers its land in hard surfaces, the faster and larger its stormwater surges become, and the harder those surges hit anything downstream. Nogales, Sonora sits uphill. The wash runs downhill, north, into the United States. There was no coordination. Sonora's development approvals contained no mechanism to account for downstream flood impacts in a foreign country. No cross-border zoning review existed. No binational drainage impact assessment was required. No international agreement governed impervious surface expansion in the shared watershed. Just gravity and decades of industrial growth, and a natural channel with no choice but to carry what came. By the early 1990s, the flooding had been a documented fact of life in downtown Nogales, Arizona, for more than a decade. Along the commercial streets nearest the wash, Grand Avenue, and the blocks adjacent to the channel, small business owners had developed a grimly practical seasonal routine. Sandbags before monsoon season. Inventory moved off ground level every summer. Insurance claims filed and disputed. Damage logged in photographs that nobody outside the city ever seemed to look at closely. When the floods came, they came fast. The wash could fill within minutes of a heavy storm in Sonora. Warnings were rarely sufficient. By the time water appeared in the street, the window to move product or equipment had already closed. What the water left behind was not just structural damage. It left sewage residue on floors, walls, and merchandise. The smell persisted for days. Business owners learned, through repeated cycles, that the cleanup was entirely on them, that the source of the damage was upstream, international, and for all practical purposes, unreachable. The moral logic was not complicated. Rain fell in Mexico. It ran off Mexican rooftops and Mexican roads. It crossed the border and damaged American property. The cost of cleanup came out of American pockets, and the legal framework governing the waterway between them contained no provision, not one, that allowed a single dollar of that damage to be formally attributed to the upstream country. Dozens of Nogales residents and business owners lived this pattern across flood events in 1977, 1983, and the years between. Their accumulated losses formed the human ledger that eventually sat underneath the federal authorization to build. It took the federal government a long time to consult that ledger. The International Boundary and Water Commission was established in its modern form under the treaty regarding utilization of waters of the Colorado and Tijuana rivers and of the Rio Grande, signed in 1944, commonly called the 1944 Water Treaty. The treaty was built for a specific purpose, allocating the shared water resources of the Colorado River and the Rio Grande between the US and Mexico, and maintaining the international boundary line. It created the IBWC on the American side and its Mexican counterpart, the Comisión Internacional de Límites y Aguas, CILA, on the Mexican side. Each commissioner holds ambassadorial rank. The commission has operated continuously since 1944. What the 1944 treaty does not contain: any cost apportionment formula tied to upstream land use. Any provision allowing the United States to recover flood damage, costs from a foreign government based on that government's development decisions. Any mechanism for cross-border environmental liability in a shared watershed. Any instrument designed to address what happens when one country's population expands dramatically faster than its downstream neighbors and the hydrological consequence crosses the line. The treaty gave the IBWC operating authority over shared waterways on American soil. American law, specifically the federal obligation to protect American residents from documented flood hazards, required the US side to act regardless of where the water originated. That combination created a structural trap. The United States had a clear legal obligation to address the flooding in Nogales, Arizona, and no legal mechanism to recover the cost from the country generating the runoff. So it paid. The Nogales International Flood Control Project, the concrete line channel and stormwater management infrastructure, eventually constructed through both cities, was funded primarily through U.S. federal appropriations administered by the IBWC. Mexico's financial contribution to the project was real but substantially smaller. IBWC project records and congressional appropriations documents reflect a heavily American-funded cost structure for infrastructure designed to manage runoff produced largely by Mexican urban development. The political context made any serious cost dispute nearly impossible to pursue. The maquiladora economy was, by the 1990s, deeply intertwined with American manufacturing interests. Major U.S. corporations held production operations in Nogales, Sonora. NAFTA's passage in 1994 formalized the cross-border supply chains that depended on the maquiladora model. Raising a formal diplomatic dispute over flood cost liability in that environment was politically untenable. Nogales, Arizona, was too small, too poor, and too marginal to generate the kind of national pressure that might have forced a different outcome. The treaty structure made the obligation unavoidable. The political economy made the cost fight unwinnable. The flooding problem in Nogales was not a discovery. IBWC and EPA documentation of water quality violations in the Nogales Wash goes back to at least the early 1970s. Fecal coliform, heavy metals, elevated sediment load. The monitoring existed. The records existed. Congressional testimony from Nogales city officials entered the public record in the 1970s, describing flood events, sewage contamination, economic destruction, and the structural cause upstream. The Nogales International Flood Control Project was formally proposed and formally studied well before construction ever began. IBWC planning documents and congressional authorization requests for a flood control channel circulated through the legislative process through the 1970s and into the 1980s. The project underwent multiple design iterations and multiple rounds of partial funding authorization that were never sufficient to begin construction. Appropriations appeared in one budget cycle and disappeared in the next. Environmental impact assessments were conducted, reviewed, and updated. The design kept changing. The estimated price kept rising. The wastewater dimension produced its own enforcement trail. The Nogales International Wastewater Treatment Plant, which processes sewage from both cities near the international line, became subject to EPA oversight and consent order proceedings related to discharge violations. The wastewater enforcement and the stormwater flooding issue shared a root cause. Sonora's municipal infrastructure could not keep pace with its population growth, and what it couldn't contain crossed the line. None of this was obscure. The problem was documented, studied, litigated through regulatory proceedings, and described in federal testimony for decades. What it was not was politically urgent enough to fund immediately. Nogales never had that leverage. It had documentation. And documentation, in this case, was not enough. The first structural twist here is worth sitting with. The delay was not cost neutral. Every year the project was deferred was a year of continued flooding, continued sewage contamination, continued property destruction, and escalating construction costs. Part of what eventually totaled more than $500 million in federal spending is not engineering, it is delay. It is the accumulated price of a problem that was known for decades and treated consistently as secondary to constituencies with more political weight. The Nogales International Flood Control Project was eventually built. Construction on the main concrete line channel advanced in stages through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The IBWC managed the project on both sides of the international line, a piece of civil infrastructure jointly maintained across a US-Mexico border crossing, running directly beneath the border fence itself. By the time the major construction phases were complete, flood events on the Arizona side had been substantially reduced. The channel performs its function. That is not in question. But here is what else the channel accomplished. It removed the hydraulic consequence from Sonora's development choices. Before the channel existed, uncontrolled flooding in Arizona was at least a visible symptom of growth upstream, a real-world harm that was difficult to ignore and that created, at minimum, a documented political record. The completed channel absorbed that consequence. It engineered the problem out of sight, and in doing so, it eliminated the most tangible brake on continued development in Nogales, Sonora. The hillsides could keep getting paved, the factory districts could expand, the impervious surface could grow. Because now an American-funded concrete infrastructure system stood ready to receive whatever came north. The 1944 treaty was never amended. The IBWC has no authority to levy costs on Mexico based on Sonora's development activity. Any future urbanization in Nogales, Sonora continues to generate runoff into the wash. That runoff continues to flow north. The American-built channel continues to receive it. The cost of maintaining that infrastructure continues to fall on the same side it always has. The concrete channel also permanently eliminated the Nogales Wash as a living ecosystem. The riparian corridor, desert vegetation, wildlife routes, a natural buffer documented by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Arizona borderland conservation organizations, was removed by channelization. The flooding problem was solved by replacing a functioning desert wetland with a drainage structure. One problem closed. One system gone for good. The two countries share a border, a watershed, and a piece of concrete. What they have never shared, what the 1944 framework has never compelled them to share, is the cost of what happens when one of them grows and the other absorbs the consequence. Stand at the border fence where the concrete channel passes underneath it. What you are looking at is a drainage ditch, gray walls, a trickle of water most of the year, occasional maintenance equipment. The fence bisects the channel cleanly, and on both sides, the infrastructure looks exactly like what it is: utilitarian civil engineering in one of the most obscure urban corridors on the continent. What it actually is a record. It is a record of what happens when two countries share a watershed. One of them urbanizes rapidly, and the legal framework governing their relationship was designed for a world that no longer exists. A treaty written in 1944 to allocate river water and draw boundary lines applied, for lack of anything better, to a stormwater problem its authors could not have anticipated. A small, poor, politically invisible American city that sat downstream from a problem it did not create, waited decades for a federal response, and eventually received a concrete channel that fixed the flooding and guaranteed the dependency in the same move. The visible problem was never really about water. It was about what happens when the legal relationship between two countries contains no mechanism to price the hydrological consequences of growth. When one country's development decisions can flow, literally, physically, by gravity, into another country's infrastructure budget, and the framework governing that relationship has no instrument to balance the equation. The channel doesn't move the problem somewhere else. It makes the problem invisible. It converts decades of contested liability, deferred funding, documented contamination, and political inaction into something that looks, from the outside, like an ordinary piece of municipal drainage, which is, depending on how you look at it, exactly what $500 million bought.